Oh no, there's another volcano. Will it affect your short-term rental in Bali? Stay tuned on the Bali Business Review and find out while I analyze a deep dive into volcanic activity and its impact on short-term rentals here in Bali. So, once again, this is Jing with Market Insights here on the Bali Business Review. And if you haven't seen recently, there's been a volcanic eruption in East Nusa Tenggara and this particular volcano. I'm going to try to pronounce it slowly. It is called Laki. Okay, so let's take a look at how this particular volcano might have impact or might not have impact on rentals here in Bali. First, why does volcanic activity have anything to do with flights? What is going on there? So here's an interesting piece of trivia. Back in 1982, British Airways Flight 009 was flying a 747 that was coming from London Heathrow with stops in Bombay, Kuala Lumpur, Perth, and Melbourne. So apparently what had happened was that this particular airplane right here, seen over here, this was the flight 009, and this is once again in 1982. So there was a volcano, it was called Mount Galunggung, and it was southeast of Jakarta, and it threw up a volcanic ash. The ash got sucked into the engines, and what happens with volcanic ash is that it's high in silica content. Silica is, of course, the component of glass. So what happens in a hot turbine engine that's sucking in a lot of the base material to make glass is that it starts turning into kind of a glass jelly that then starts clogging and creating this bad effect on the airplane engine inside the turbine. So what happens as a result of this ash being sucked in and this jellification inside the turbines is that the engines stall. Thankfully, all the engines were able to be restarted. But you can imagine after an incident like that with engine stalling on a 747 carrying like 400 or 500 passengers, they're not going to take chances again, okay? So what happens now is whenever there's a volcano, then the flights are typically diverted around the volcano or in extreme cases, they've been canceled. So let's take a look at this particular volcano today to see if it has any impact on, let's say, visitor arrivals to Bali. So the first thing we should check is to get an idea of the distance. Where exactly is Lewotobi in comparison to our current position in Bali? So let's go ahead, and what we'll do is we'll go to our screen over here and we'll try to find it. And so if you look for Lewotobi, you'll see that it is on this island. This is one of the far eastern islands of Indonesia. It is on the far east side of East Nusa Tenggara. So the distance approximately between this particular point in Bali is, let's go ahead and measure it. So we're going to go and use the really awesome measure distance tool in Google Maps, and we're going to measure the distance approximately to Bali. So we'll do a few lines over here, going through West Nusa Tenggara, going through Lombok, and we'll hit the Bali airport. And it's a little bit hard to see, but there you have it. It's approximately 524 miles. Sorry, I'm having to be in the US right now. For those of you who don't use miles, it's about 843 kilometers, which is quite a significant distance away. That on a normal jet is about a 2-hour flight from Bali. So let's take a look and try to predict if this has any impact on Bali. Of course, if the wind is blowing from the east to the west, that would carry ash over across all the islands, eventually to Bali, which would then, of course, affect all flights coming to Bali. But let's see which direction the wind is actually blowing. So the wind, if you take a look using a wind map, this is a beautiful wind map that we have here. This is under the Wind Finder website. We can see that, thankfully, at this point in the year, all the major winds are blowing from the west. So that means it's blowing across Bali, across Nusa Tenggara, and blowing the ash to the east. And there are some winds over here that you can see that are blowing probably the ash to the south, to where Australia is. Okay, so that means essentially this. That means this ash does not have a potential danger of reaching the Bali airport, but it will fly into the pathway of some flights coming from northwest Australia, such as perhaps Darwin or some of these cities along the west coast of Australia, and that might be the lead of some cancellations, okay? But are we talking about a large number of cancellations? Let's go ahead and take a look at the flight schedules. So if we go ahead and take a look at, let's say, some of the flights happening right now, in fact, in Bali, we can see that, of course, there are still flights coming from the west about to land in Bali right now, and there are flights also coming from the east. So it looks like flights are still moving on as usual by looking at flightaware.com. That gives us air tracking on what's happening right now. So that's strong evidence to see that the airport seems to be still functional. But let's go ahead and zoom out a little bit and see what it looks like for flight schedules. For that, we go to the East Nusa Tenggara International Airport website, where we can check on all the international flights that are about to come and the international flights. As you can see, all international flights for today, or at least most of them, seem to be on track. There's over what I would guess to be 30 flights. And the finale of the evening is Singapore Airlines SQ0948 coming in from Singapore, due to land at around midnight on the 24th of March. Now, Singapore Airlines will fly. They have some of the most rigorous safety standards of all major airlines, almost an impeccable safety record. So if Singapore Airlines thinks it's a good to go, then it's probably okay. All right. So anyhow, what does this tell us about essentially this volcano's impact to Bali? Nothing, probably nil. Let's go double check to see if Airbnb has a policy. So we'll go to Airbnb, we'll go volcano, and we'll go eruption, Indonesia. Let's see if they have an extenuating circumstance right now. Right now, it does not look like there is essentially a nope. All right, I don't see it. Disaster response tool in Bali. Okay, that was in 2017. Okay, all right. So far, we did not see any extenuating circumstance cancellation policy issued by Airbnb or any of the other major travel platforms to forestall, let's say, excuse cancellations for passengers unable to arrive to Bali due to the volcano. Okay, so that's another indicator of how serious a particular natural disaster is, because generally speaking, if there is essentially a serious natural disaster, travel platforms will activate an extenuating circumstance call and allow for penalty-free cancellations, which so far hasn't happened yet. Okay, all right, so what does this mean in terms of overall activity and such? Historically, Bali has not always been so blessed. There have been volcanoes, including Gunung Agung, which erupted in 2017 and continued in small eruptions all the way up to 2019. How do I know this? Because my wife's family, our in-laws, are actually from Karangsam in East Bali. They literally live in the shadow of Gunung Agung, not too far away. So when the volcano was experiencing some and let's say pre-eruption activities, the ground was already shaking, there were some tremors, and the geologists were warning for the families in that area to evacuate. They fled. They came all the way back down Jimbaran to our part of the island, which is about 80 or so kilometers away. Long story short, the intense activity of volcanoes throughout Indonesia does present a unique risk to, let's say, short-term rentals, but in a sort of mollified way, and I'll explain why. So the actual experience of when we did have that volcano back in 2017 was, yes, it was bad because it did put Bukit Vista, the company that I'm the leader of, out of business for a while. It wasn't as bad nearly as COVID. COVID was far worse because it was far longer and there was no activity. But it did make us in a hurry to expand our frontiers and eventually reach to Jakarta to look for properties that we could manage. However, the strange irony at the time was that even though there was a volcano, there was actually this somewhat balance of travel, because as soon as flights canceled, that means no inbound visitors could come to Bali, but no outbound flights were available, so people who were stuck in Bali, they would simply have to extend their stays. But knowing that the volcano eventually led to, let's say, a closure of the airports, that stopped anybody from planning future trips to Bali. And that was very unfortunate, and it did forestall performance in terms of investment value to many properties throughout the island for months. So that was an unanticipated act of God. That was a risk. Now, is this going to happen in the future? Indonesia is on the ring of fire, so this is a digestible risk. It is essentially a tangible risk. Is it going to affect you every day? I don't know. I'm not a volcanologist. I'm not a geologist, and I would care to say that during my 20 years in Bali, I've only seen 1, 2, 3, probably 4 volcanic eruptions that affected maybe about 3 or 4 months of overall booking activity over 20 years. So that's 240 months. So not necessarily a major risk in the long term, but however, it can happen. As you can see, it does happen. And I think the smartest thing, once again, is just to be well informed, understand why it happens, how it affects airplanes, how airlines are essentially trying to defend themselves against such risk, but also be smart and calculate that when you go and decide how you want to enter the market. All right, this is Jing again, signing off from a short episode here in response to the volcanic eruption in East Nusa Tenggara. We hope that everybody out there stay safe, stay healthy, avoid any misfortune out there in East Indonesia. And another episode of Market Insights from the Bali Business Review. Signing off again. If you like what you're hearing, don't forget to comment or subscribe, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.